The Atlantic Ocean was not merely water. It was a geography of gray dread. Beneath the steel deck of the transport ship, the engines thudded in a slow, suffocating rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the miles westward. Thud, 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 thud. One heartbeat for every mile gained away from the ruins of Europe, deeper into the maw of the enemy. Salt mist clung to everything. It slicked the rusted iron railings, dampened the wooden planks of the deck, and settled like a cold sweat on the faces of the men standing at the rail. It darkened the wool of their coats, the ash-gray greatcoats of the German Wehrmacht. These were coats that had seen the mud of the Ukraine, the snows of the Ardennes, and the polished corridors of Berlin. Now they were heavy with sea spray and defeat. The wind out here did not just blow, it cut. It sliced through the layers of wool and uniform cloth with a smell that was distinct to the North Atlantic, a smell of iron, freezing rain, and the deep, abyssal rot of the ocean. Huddled near the starboard rail stood General Carl Heinrich Vogler. He was 52 years old, a man whose face was a map of the war's shifting front lines, deep fissures of exhaustion carved into pale skin. A month earlier, he had commanded 15,000 men near the Rhine, moving divisions like chess pieces in a desperate defense of the fatherland. Now, he was a commander without an army, an officer without a pistol, a man whose authority had evaporated into the sea air. He was not alone. Around him, haunting the deck like specters, were 60 other generals. This was the high command of a vanished Reich, confined to a single transport ship, bound for an enemy's shore. Orders from the American MPs strictly forbade conversation with the ship's crew, creating a bubble of silence around the prisoners. Yet, inside that bubble, the air was thick with noise. Rumors whispered between the prisoners, filling every corner of the deck, swirling like the fog that choked the horizon. "America is in chaos," one general whispered, his eyes darting toward the American sailors on the upper deck. "Their cities burn. We have heard the reports. They are broken internally. They need us as trophies to distract the populace." Another man, General Herman Dent, once a decorated staff officer known for his impeccable strategy, muttered into his collar, "It is theater, all of it. They will parade us before their mobs. They will throw us into cages in the center of their burning cities to be stoned." A third voice spoke with a hollow, brittle conviction, the kind of faith men hold on to when the world is ending. They starve behind their machines. Look at this ship. Rust and noise. They live on canned food and slogans. Their economy collapsed years ago. It is a facade. Vogler said nothing. He gripped the wet railing, his knuckles white. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda had drilled these claims into every radio broadcast for years. The Americans are soft. The Americans are mongrels. The Americans are starving. He had heard it in the mess halls of France and the bunkers of Poland. But doubt is a parasite. Once whispered, it multiplies in the silence of the mind. He looked at the American guards. They did not look starved. They did not look desperate. They looked bored. The voyage stretched on, a purgatory of waves and waiting. But at dawn on the final day, the call came. Landfall. The prisoners were ordered topside. The sound of 60 pairs of boots scraping against metal ladders echoed through the ship's belly. Guards shouted instructions in sharp, clipped English. The diesel engines growled louder, shifting pitch as the vessel crept through a curtain of gray fog so thick it felt like wool against the skin. For an hour, they saw nothing, just the gray water merging with the gray sky. They braced themselves. They expected to see ruins. They expected to see the blackened skeletons of bombed-out harbors, the wreckage of a war that had consumed the world. Then the mist parted. It didn't fade. It tore open, and disbelief swept the deck like a physical wind. New York Harbor unfurled before them. It was not a scene of ruin. It was a vision of terrifying radiance. Cranes, dozens of them, hundreds of them, moved along the waterfront like prehistoric giants, lifting entire city blocks of steel and crates with effortless grace. Freight barges, loaded heavy with mountains of black coal, slipped silently under skeletal bridges that gleamed like silver spiderwebs in the morning light. And beyond them, beyond the industry, rose the towers, rows of glass and stone climbing higher than any cathedral in Europe, untouched by war, sharp against the rising sun. The skyline looked impossibly alive. It shimmered with an electric vitality that seemed to mock the destruction of the old world. Vogler squinted at it, the salt stinging his eyes, or perhaps it was tears of shock. He couldn't tell. "It's a mirage," his aide whispered, his voice trembling. "It has to be a mirage." No one answered. Even the ship's guards seemed quieter, as if the sheer scale of the view subdued friend and foe alike. Then came the smell. It hit Vogler before his mind could process the sight. In Europe, the air smelled of wet plaster, charred wood, unburied bodies, and sulfur. It was the reek of despair baked into stone. Here, the wind carried abundance. It was a metallic sweetness. The scent of refined oil blending with the rich, dark aroma of roasted coffee wafting from shore warehouses. Beneath that, the faint, impossible trace of baking bread. Civilization had an aroma, a scent of production and excess that he hadn't inhaled in years. He flashed suddenly to Berlin, streets littered with rubble, dust choking the air, the gray faces of women standing in line for turnips. Here, the air smelled of breakfast. The prisoners lined the deck rail motionless, a gallery of disbelief. General Dent spoke without irony, his voice barely audible over the water. They said democracy was decadent. He stared at a barge overflowing with timber. Perhaps it merely went unfed. Others sneered reflexively, trying to summon the armor of their ideology, but their eyes betrayed a deep, gnawing curiosity. As the ship slipped past Staten Island, the silhouette of the Statue of Liberty emerged from the haze. Her copper skin was oxidized green, but her torch caught the new sunlight like burnished gold. Laughter rippled uneasily among the German officers. A jagged, nervous sound. "So she still stands," someone murmured in German. One officer, perhaps out of instinct or perhaps out of sarcasm, began to salute her, then stopped halfway, turning the gesture into a wipe of his brow. He stared up at the giant woman of copper, looking for the cracks, looking for the bomb damage. There was none. "She faces east," Vogler noted silently. "Toward us." When the vessel finally moored at the docks of New Jersey, the generals braced themselves for the anger of the enemy. They tightened their coats, they stiffened their spines. They prepared to be spat upon, to be pelted with rocks, to face the screaming mobs of a nation they had declared war upon. But the Americans waited not with cheers or triumph, not with hatred or vengeance, but with professional indifference. Cargo cranes swung above them, deafening and relentless. Stevedores shouted coordinates for crates stamped with names like General Motors and Ford. Civilian clerks with clipboards stacked forms, checking manifests, barely glancing at the men who had once terrified Europe. The efficiency of it unsettled the generals more than hostility would have. Hatred implies respect. It implies you are a threat. This was simply logistics. Here was victory drilled not by force, but by habit. As they were led down the gangway, cameras flashed. Reporters in fedoras jotted notes, cigarettes dangling from their lips, while soldiers herded the prisoners onto waiting trucks. No one struck them. No one spat. Instead, an American colonel, their escort, stepped forward. He removed his cap, revealing a face that looked more like a schoolteacher than a warrior. He nodded politely. "Welcome to the United States, gentlemen." The translator's voice repeated the words in German, and for a heartbeat, they hung suspended in unreality. Welcome. Vogler stepped onto solid ground. The wooden dock vibrated faintly under his boots, a tremor caused by the ceaseless movement of heavy freight. Farther inland, the skyline shimmered through an industrial haze. He saw tanks of gasoline, miles of trucks, stacks of crates stamped with factory names he'd never heard. He realized then, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that every unit of industry around him worked like a symphony without a conductor. Each player followed an invisible rhythm of commerce and supply. The dock smelled of sweat, steel, and optimism. The noise was furious, yet ordered. America's informal authority performed through motion, not salute. Vogler turned toward the harbor one last time, watching the statue's silhouette diminish with distance. He felt the war shrink too, collapsing behind him into the wake that glittered briefly and was gone. Nothing around him matched the enemy he had imagined. Germany had called this a country of improvisation, of cowboys and gangsters, yet it looked engineered by confidence. He found himself thinking, if this is decadence, what does strength look like? The convoy of military trucks rattled out of the harbor, weaving through the downtown streets of a New Jersey industrial district that shimmered under a clean morning sun. The generals, sitting on wooden benches in the back of open-air vehicles, clung to the sides as skyscrapers flanked them like canyon walls. Every window glinted with light. There were no boarded-up storefronts, no sandbags piled against doorways. From those dizzying heights hung laundry, white sheets, colorful dresses, radio antennas, and the ordinary terrifying rhythm of civilian life. No city in Germany looked like this anymore. For the high command of a vanished Reich, it was unbearable to compare. Berlin had been reduced to soot and silence. Munich was a graveyard of empty shells where churches used to be. Hamburg was ash. Yet here, the enemy's metropolis pulsed as if untouched by the apocalypse that had consumed the rest of the world. There were no ration lines. There were no craters in the asphalt. There were only shop fronts filled with goods the generals hadn't seen since before the Depression. They passed a corner store. In the window, pyramids of oranges, stacks of rubber tires, nylon stockings, fresh meat hanging in the butcher's glass. A woman in a yellow dress crossed the street holding a child's hand. The child held a red balloon. They looked healthy, they looked clean. And the convoy of German captives turned their heads at once, momentarily forgetting that they were prisoners, staring with the raw hunger of men who had forgotten what peace looked like. Their disbelief thickened into a quiet stupor as the trucks moved north toward the rail yards. "They are pretending," a general whispered, his voice trembling with denial. "This is staged for us, Potemkin villages. They knew we were coming, but every mile drew new evidence that it was not staged. You cannot stage a traffic jam of civilian automobiles. You cannot stage 1,000 factory workers changing shifts, laughing, smoking, carrying lunch pails filled with white bread and meat. Freight trains drifted past them on parallel tracks, carrying lumber, cattle, and steel. American workers waved to the guards, and even to the prisoners, as though there was nothing extraordinary about escorting former enemy commanders through their city. From the rail depot, the prisoners were loaded into Pullman-style cars. They hesitated at the doors. They expected cattle cars. The wooden boxes with straw on the floor, the kind they had used to transport their own prisoners across the East. Instead, they stepped onto plush carpets, padded velvet seats, polished mahogany trim, windows that opened easily to let in the breeze. There were even baggage racks for their battered duffels. The absurd comfort embarrassed them. They sat awkwardly, keeping their knees together, afraid to touch the luxury. 2 guards stationed in the aisle removed their caps, nodded, and offered them coffee. Not the chicory sludge of the front, but real coffee, black and steaming, served in paper cups. "Coffee?" the guard asked, holding out a pot. For men still expecting punishment, those gestures unsettled them more than hostility would have. Violence they understood. Violence was a language they spoke fluently. But this casual hospitality, it was a weapon they had no defense against. The train headed south toward Fort Hunt, Virginia, and then farther into the country. The scenery changed quickly, steel and smoke giving way to meadows dotted with barns and white-steepled towns. Vogler sat by the window, the paper cup warming his hands. He watched the American landscape unfurl. It was vast, terrifyingly vast. Children riding bicycles paused on dirt roads to stare at the locomotive thundering by. Some waved. None shouted insults. It was the first time the prisoners had glimpsed enemy civilians who looked untouched by exhaustion. In Europe, 6 years of war had chiseled faces into masks of suspicion and hollow-cheeked fatigue. Here, the strangers lining the tracks smiled with the unself-conscious confidence of people certain of tomorrow. Their escort, the mild-mannered Colonel Williams, sat near the front reading a newspaper. Vogler cleared his throat. "Colonel?" Williams lowered the paper. "Yes, General?" "Did the States suffer much bombing?" Vogler asked. He needed to know. He needed to find the scar on this pristine body. Williams paused, blinking, as though he didn't quite understand the question. "Bombing? No. No German plane ever reached us. He thought for a moment. Your subs came close, sank some tankers off the coast, but damage to the mainland? None. The explanation struck the generals more sharply than contempt. None. Their enemy had been untouchable. While Germany burned, while Russia bled, America had simply turned up the volume of its industry. By late afternoon, the train slowed through farmland quilted in green. Vogler pressed his palm to the cold glass of the window. He realized the tracks ran perfectly straight for miles. There were no diversions for bomb craters, no twisted metal. Imagine laying rails this flat, someone muttered behind him, half admiring, half aghast. They built an empire by geometry. Even their agriculture reflected strategy. Rows of corn aligned like drill formations. Barns painted bright red, huge and well-maintained as if celebrating abundance. Silos rose like watchtowers, but they were filled with grain, not gunmen. Vogler closed his eyes. He tried to reconcile the propaganda he had preached, that democracy was weak, chaotic, a mongrel system doomed to fail, with the truth vibrating through the floor of the train. This was a machine, a continent-sized machine of logistics and supply, and he was traveling through its arteries. At Fort Hunt, the generals descended into a gentler captivity than they had ever imagined, or indeed, than they had ever offered to their own prisoners. They were led not to cages, not to damp dungeons, but to a campus, low barracks shaded by ancient oak trees, gravel paths raked clean. Each group had officer quarters with clean bedding, writing desks, and lamps. Water ran clear and plentiful from the taps, hot and cold. Every man received 3 uniforms, U.S. Army khaki stenciled with the letters PW on the back, freshly laundered and stiff with starch. Then came the food. Dinner at 1800 hours. The mess hall smelled of roast beef and steamed vegetables. The trays were piled high. Meat, potatoes with butter, glasses of cold milk, white bread baked on site. Geneva Convention, the interpreter said almost teasingly, watching the generals stare at the food. The United States Army adheres strictly to the caloric requirements. Vogler noticed that regulations were enforced without shouting. Orders were given once in calm voices and obeyed immediately. There was no barking, no strutting, no performative cruelty. Disciplined by consent, it was a military language he did not yet speak. The United States government had multiple reasons for bringing its prominent captives here. Information, negotiation, maybe future leverage. But the practical reason was simpler. Space. American soil was distant from vengeance, unscarred enough to hold enemies without the immediate urge to destroy them. Thousands of POWs picked crops, built roads, or repaired equipment across the country, while their generals stayed in these guarded enclaves, undergoing long debriefings under the supervision of polite men with fountain pens. Yet the capture produced an unintended experiment in sociology. After years of preaching German superiority, the Reich's highest officers found themselves living inside an efficiency greater than anything they had authored. They were living inside comfort maintained by ordinary citizens. At night, lying awake in spotless barracks, they listened to the country's noise carry over the river. They heard heavy freight trains whistling in the distance, a sound of commerce that never slept. They heard church bells. And, most disquieting of all, they heard laughter and the crack of a bat from a nearby baseball field where the off-duty guards played under floodlights. These were not the sounds of decadence. They were the cadence of a nation sure of its direction. The generals began to ask questions quietly among themselves in the dark. How could a nation of such wealth and disorder defeat a disciplined Europe? General Dent asked one night, staring at the ceiling. How could democracy, messy, argumentative, decentralized, produce power so serene? They have not been humiliated by force, Vogler answered softly. We are being dismantled by example. The longer they remained in America, the less their captivity resembled imprisonment. It was the shock of freedom inside confinement. The quiet paradox was what unsettled them most. Fort Hunt was never intended as punishment. The U.S. Army Intelligence Service treated it as a laboratory for understanding, a place to study the minds that had driven Europe into darkness. Yet, for the men behind those fences, it became something stranger, a vision of a civilization they had been blind to. Daylight revealed the rhythm of the place. Trucks brought milk from local dairies, glass bottles sweating with condensation. Young soldiers in spotless shirts unloaded not whips but newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, placing them in the common room. At 0700 sharp, breakfast. Oatmeal, fruit, coffee. At 0730, lectures began. Some lectures were about agriculture, others about engineering, ostensibly to keep their intellects occupied. There was conversation instead of coercion, curiosity where they expected contempt. One morning, a U.S. officer named Captain Hollis arrived to discuss logistics. He was barely 30, with sandy hair and a calm voice that cracked into humor every few minutes. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a graduate student. He asked General Vogler to sketch how the Wehrmacht had managed supply lines along the Eastern Front during the winter of '41. They stood together at a blackboard. Vogler drew the rail lines, the depots, the choke points. Hollis nodded, asking sharp, technical questions. The gauge width was the problem, Vogler explained, chalk dust coating his fingers. We had to transfer every ton of supplies from European trains to Russian tracks. When the session ended, Hollis handed Vogler a rag to wipe his hands. "Your roads were genius, General," Hollis said, studying the map. "But you ran them like a clock wound too tightly. One gear strips, the whole thing stops." Vogler blinked at the bluntness. No propaganda, just analysis. "And you?" Vogler asked. "How do you run your lines?" Hollis smiled, a lopsided, easy grin. "We like a little slack in the line. Things break. You gotta trust the driver to fix it, not the general. That's the American way. We don't trust the plan, we trust the man." The conversation stopped Vogler cold because it assumed equality. An enemy treating him as a peer meant the ideology he'd lived by, of superiority earned through titles and rank, had evaporated. By autumn 1945, the war was over, but the captivity continued. The generals were moved to other camps inland, Algona, Iowa, Butner, North Carolina, Troutville, Virginia. Each relocation peeled away another layer of expectation. Crossing the Mississippi River by rail, they saw towns buzzing with consumer life. Grocery signs were lit with neon even in full sunlight. Children dragged radio flyer wagons down sidewalks. Women in polka-dot dresses bought fruit that seemed inexhaustible, pyramids of apples, bushels of peaches. Every American landscape looked rehearsed for abundance. Propaganda had warned them that liberty led to laziness, that democracy was mob rule. But the democracy they saw wore work clothes. It farmed, it paved highways, and it kept factories running at dawn with no Gestapo to watch over it. At Camp Butner, they met their new guards. These weren't career soldiers. They were reservists, college graduates waiting for their discharge papers. One guard had studied philosophy at Ohio State. He loaned the prisoners a copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. "You'll like this one," the guard said, handing the book through the wire. "Self-reliance. It sounds like your Nietzsche, but it smiles more." The men read under bare bulbs late into the night, line by line, struggling with the English, learning a language of authority that didn't depend on fear. "No one orders him," one general murmured, tapping the page. "He orders himself." The small revelations kept compounding. When Christmas arrived, the guards hung thin paper garlands between the dining hall rafters. After the meal, turkey with cranberry dressing, nearly identical to what the Americans ate, they distributed gift parcels from humanitarian groups. Inside each parcel, cigarettes, writing paper, chocolate, and a card printed with a single word, peace. It wasn't propaganda. It looked handmade, almost naive. Vogler tested the letters with his thumb, as if the ink itself might smudge into a hidden motive. There was no trick, just intention. Then came the reunion of opposites. General Claiborne Rhee, a veteran of Patton's staff, visited the camp as a liaison. He entered the barracks unceremoniously, saluted, and said, "We never met on the field. Let's meet properly now." He clasped Vogler's hand without hesitation. The contact sliced through the last emotional armor left. In that handshake was the final insult to ideology. kindness unfazed by rank. But for General Carl Heinrich Vogler, the final, shattering revelation came not from a handshake nor from a book, but from a simple invitation. The camp commandant had arranged a tour of a nearby town for a handful of officers judged cooperative. Vogler joined reluctantly, expecting a display of military might. The trucks rolled through open gates for the first time. They passed farms so orderly they looked like paintings. Cows grazing within perfect white fences. Tractors gleaming under stored sunlight. Then came the town. Algona, Iowa, red brick storefronts, a movie theater promoting a Frank Sinatra film. The scent of cut hay and gasoline. Yet what stunned the men most were the people's eyes. Shoppers looked up as the truck passed, not with hatred, not with fascination, but with casual acknowledgement. A grocer waved. A child, seeing the uniforms, ran up to the slow-moving truck and handed them a stick of gum. To a class raised on fear, on the belief that the world was a struggle for dominance, this indifference felt holy. They were escorted to the edge of town, to a massive structure rising from the flat earth. A grain elevator, an industrial cathedral of the plains. They stepped inside. The noise was deafening. Conveyor belts clattered beneath arched beams tall as church vaults carrying tons of golden corn skyward. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light like gold dust. An American engineer explained the process in good-humored detail, shouting over the roar of the machinery. "Feeds cattle, feeds people, feeds exports, keeps Liberty fat," he joked. Vogler gazed upward at the flow of grain, civilization literally ascending before him. It was a river of sustenance. He turned to General Dent and whispered, his voice lost in the noise. "They devote architecture to food." Dent, eyes wide, answered quietly, "And we devoted it to power." Vogler looked back at the engineer, who was laughing with a worker. He realized then that Dent was wrong. This was power. This was the terrifying, undeniable power of a system that could feed the world while fighting a war. It was a weapon they had never accounted for. That night, back at camp, Vogler requested paper. He drafted a letter fewer than 2 pages long, addressed to no one in particular, half confession, half farewell. "I came to this country expecting to measure its weapons, and have instead measured its conscience. Here, the factories sing louder than armies. They are ruled by imagination, not ideology." He left the letter unsigned, folded it, and placed it in the drawer of the small writing desk provided by his hosts. By the summer of 1946, the lists for repatriation began to circulate. The captivity was ending. A strange melancholy settled over the camp. Home meant wreckage. Home meant the Nuremberg trials, the shame of defeat, the mountains of rubble that used to be cities. America had become the nearest functioning idea of civilization they knew. When the time for departure came, the formalities were brief. Each prisoner received a ration parcel, $20 in compensation for their labor, and a stamped document certifying honorable conduct. Before boarding the ship at Norfolk, the officers stood one final time on an American pier. It was raining, a warm summer rain that dotted their caps. Above them, steel cranes swung, unloading trucks full of household goods. The war material was gone. Now, the docks were filled with washing machines, tractors, lumber, and steel for rebuilding. War had already vanished into production again. An aide asked Vogler, "General, what will you most remember of America? The skyscrapers? The food?" Vogler listened. He closed his eyes. He heard the screech of the crane, the shout of the foreman, the distant hum of a generator, the rumble of a diesel truck. He opened his eyes and said simply, "It's noise. The noise of creation." The voyage home mirrored the first, the same gray ocean, the same rolling deck, yet none of them looked back with contempt. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a somber reflection. Through the fog they saw her again. The Statue of Liberty. She was no longer a mirage. She was a peacetime audience now, greeting them not as enemies, but as men returning to history's unfinished lesson. Silence spread along the deck. There were no jokes, no sneers. "She faces east," Dent whispered, standing beside Vogler, "toward Europe." "Yes," Vogler replied, Perhaps, Dent said, she is still waiting for us to learn. Vogler watched the copper giant fade into the mist. He felt the $20 bill in his pocket. He thought of the grain elevator in Iowa. He thought of the guard who read Emerson. In later years, those captured officers would cite their imprisonment in America as the beginning of their reconciliation with democracy. Some advised the rebuilding of the West German Army, restructuring it along principles they had first glimpsed through barbed wire, authority answerable to the governed. Others refused to serve at all, instead writing memoirs confessing that the true defeat of the Reich happened not on battlefields, but in the moment they saw how decency functioned when it did not need spectacle. For Vogler, the legacy condensed into one image, a memory that would visit him until his death. He remembered a factory whistle at dawn outside Camp Algona. It rose into the limitless blue sky. Unlike the mechanical terror of German sirens, which signaled air raids and death, this whistle signaled the start of a shift. It signaled work. It signaled beginnings, not alarms. Every morning, it reminded him that power which serves creation instead of destruction is a rarer kind of victory. Long after his return to Germany, when journalists interviewed him about his time in American captivity, Vogler spoke softly, as though still uncertain that freedom could sound so ordinary. They lived abundance without arrogance, he said to the reporters, looking out at the rebuilding of Berlin. It was the first time I saw authority restrained by choice. In seeing America, the conquerors finally understood that the loudest strength need not shout. Freedom's discipline, the ability to master power through grace, was the sight that ended the war for them. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more of these kind of WW2 documentaries.